In the year of 1888, during one of the harshest winters in African history. In a small town on the Midwest frontier, life was governed by two things: the biting cold and the unyielding moral code of a deeply Christian society. Here, every action was judged, every choice scrutinized, and for a woman like Grace Hamilton, the weight of those expectations was almost unbearable. Grace worked in her father's trading post, a modest building that was both a lifeline and a source of gossip in the town. The post sold essentials for survival: flour, blankets, tools, and liquor. It was that last item that stirred the most trouble. Though Grace was simply helping her father keep the business running, the townsfolk saw it differently. A respectable woman shouldn't be handling liquor, they'd whisper. Their judgment is colder than the winter winds. The trading post's bar tucked away in the back was especially frowned upon. A gathering place for rough men with rougher habits, it casts a shadow over Grace's reputation, despite her careful efforts to stay distant from its noise and chaos. But in a small town, appearances mattered more than truth, and every glance, every whisper weighed on her. That evening the wind had begun to howl outside, rattling the shutters as snow swept through the streets. Inside the trading post was alive with noise. The clink of glasses, bursts of laughter, and the hum of quiet conversations that always seemed to carry a hint of judgment. Grace busied herself behind the counter, her thoughts as heavy as the storm clouds gathering overhead. The weight of it all, the stares, the whispers, the suffocating expectations pressed down on her. She didn't know where she would go, but one thing was certain: she needed to get out. Inside the trading post, the fire burned brightly, but for Grace, it wasn't enough to chase away the chill she felt. She moved through the aisles of goods, restocking shelves and avoiding the noise spilling from the bar at the back. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the air, and Grace did her best to block it out. A voice from one of the tables drifted over, carrying through the thin walls of the trading post. "That Hamilton girl, she's not exactly the kind of woman you'd bring home to your mother," someone said, followed by a burst of laughter. Grace froze, her hands tightening around the sack of flour she was carrying. She'd heard it all before, but tonight the words cut deeper than usual. The storm was unforgiving, a merciless force that consumed everything in its path. Grace's cloak flapped wildly in the wind as she pushed forward, her boots sinking into the snow with each step. The further she went, the more disoriented she became. The world had turned into a featureless expanse of white, and panic began to creep in. She turned to retrace her steps, but the wind had already erased her footprints. She was lost. The ground beneath her shifted. A thin layer of ice covered a creek hidden under the snow. Her boots slipped and she fell hard, her hands scraping against the frozen surface. The ice cracked beneath her weight, sending a jolt of fear through her. She scrambled to her feet, but the damage was done. Her ankle twisted painfully, and each step became agony. The cold seeped deeper into her bones as the storm mocked her every effort. Finally, her legs gave out, and she collapsed into the snow, the fight draining from her body. The storm howled around her as her world faded to black. The wind howled outside Caleb Mason's cabin, rattling the windows as snow piled against the door. He was adding another log to the fire when he heard a faint cry carried by the wind. At first, he thought he'd imagined it, but when it came, Caleb grabbed his coat and lantern and stepped outside. The storm was relentless, the cold biting through his coat as he trudged through the snow. The faint cry grew fainter, and he quickened his pace, scanning the ground with the weak light of the lantern. Then he saw a crumpled figure lying motionless in the snow. Caleb knelt beside her, brushing the snow from her face. She was pale, her lips blue, but she was alive. Barely. Caleb lifted her into his arms. The weight of her limp body pressed down on him as he trudged back through the snow. His boots slipped on icy patches, and the wind fought him every step of the way, but he didn't stop. By the time he reached the cabin, his muscles burned, but relief surged through him. She was still breathing. He laid her by the fire, wrapping her in blankets and rubbing her frozen hands. He muttered as he coaxed her to sip warm water. For hours he kept watching the fire and checking her breathing. Finally, as dawn broke, her eyes fluttered open. Caleb leaned back, exhaustion etched into his face. She was alive, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, that mattered more than it should have. When Grace opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed was the warmth. A fire crackled nearby, and the air smelled of pine and smoke. Slowly, her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she saw him. A tall man with broad shoulders and a face hardened by years in the wilderness. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "You're lucky I found you," Caleb said gruffly, placing a mug of something steaming on the table beside her. Grace tried to sit up, but the effort made her dizzy. "Where am I?" she whispered. "My cabin," Caleb replied. "You were half dead in the snow." The weight of her situation hit her all at once. She was alone in a strange man's cabin, unchaperoned. The implications made her stomach turn. Back in town, this would be enough to ruin her reputation forever. I need to leave," she stammered, trying again to sit up. Caleb shook his head. "Not in this storm, you don't. You'd be dead before you got a mile." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. Grace glanced at the window where snow was still piling up, and then back at Caleb. "Thank you," she said. Finally, her voice was barely audible. Caleb simply nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You should rest," he said. "You'll need your strength when the storm passes." As the storm began to ease, Caleb sat near the fire, his gaze drifting to the woman asleep under the blankets. He didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. He had long ago learned the value of silence. Still, as the night wore on, memories of his own past began to surface unbidden. Years ago, Caleb had lived in a town much like hers, a man with a future full of plans and ambition. But life on the frontier was cruel. A fire had destroyed his childhood home, taking with it his parents and younger siblings. The grief had driven him into the wilderness, where he carved out a life far from prying eyes and endless judgment. Out here he found a kind of peace, but also a loneliness that he couldn't quite shake. That solitude felt more fragile than ever. He told himself it was only temporary, that as soon as the storm passed, she would leave and things would go back to the way they were. But deep down, he wasn't sure he wanted them to. By the time the storm cleared, Grace was well enough to return to town. Caleb insisted on escorting her, his rifle slung over his shoulder as they trudged through the snow. But when they arrived, the stares began. Whispers spread like wildfire. "She stayed with him," someone muttered. "Alone?" The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Heads turned, voices hushed, and judgment filled the space between her and the townsfolk. Grace's father stood behind the counter of the trading post, his face pale as he listened to the murmurs. His jaw tightened and his voice was low but firm as he spoke. "Do you have any idea what this has done?" he asked, his eyes locking onto Grace's. She opened her mouth to explain, but her father shook his head. "It doesn't matter. People will believe what they want to believe." Caleb stood silently at Grace's side, his expression unreadable. Her father's gaze shifted to him, scrutinizing the man who had brought his daughter back. His voice carries more frustration than malice. Caleb didn't flinch. The kind who kept her alive replied evenly. For a moment, the tension hung thick in the room. Grace could feel the weight of every eye in the trading post. She wanted to disappear to undo the events of the past few days, but there was no escape from the reality of her situation. Her father let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping. "The only way to fix this is for you two to marry," he said finally. His voice resigned. Grace's heart sank. "Marriage?" To Caleb. It wasn't that he was unkind, far from it, but this wasn't how she had imagined her future. Caleb looked at her, his eyes steady and calm. "If it'll save your name," he said quietly, "we'll do it." There was no hesitation in his voice, no hint of frustration. Grace swallowed hard, nodding, though her hands trembled at her sides. The wedding was a simple affair held in the small church at the edge of town. A handful of townsfolk attended more out of curiosity than support. Grace wore a borrowed dress that didn't quite fit, and Caleb looked uncomfortable in a suit that had seen better days. The preacher's voice was steady as he led them through the vows, but the air in the church felt heavy with judgment. Every murmur from the onlookers reminded Grace that this wasn't a celebration, it was a sentence. Yet, as Caleb took her hand and repeated the preacher's words, there was no bitterness in his tone. Grace glanced up at him, and for a moment their eyes met. In that fleeting instant, she saw something in his gaze that she hadn't expected. Respect, understanding, and maybe even a hint of hope. She squeezed his hand lightly, finding a small measure of comfort in the steadiness of his presence. When it was over, the townsfolk dispersed quickly, the sound of their whispers lingering in the air like a faint echo. As they stepped outside into the cold, Grace glanced back at the church. It felt like leaving one life behind and stepping into another. It wasn't what she had dreamed of, but it was hers now. And for better or worse, Caleb was part of it. Life at the cabin was anything but easy. At first, their days were marked by silence and awkwardness. Caleb spent his time hunting and chopping wood, while Grace tried to make the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a home. But slowly they began to find a rhythm. As the days turned into weeks, they started to open up. Caleb told her about his past, about the fire that had taken his family, her heart aching for him. "You've been through a lot," she said softly. "You're stronger than you think," Caleb chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't tell anyone." But their fragile peace was tested when an ice storm battered the cabin, damaging the roof. They worked side by side in the freezing cold, bracing beams and patching holes. Grace's hands were raw and her patience wore thin. "This isn't easy for me," she snapped. "I didn't ask for any of this." Caleb's reply was calm but firm. "Neither did I." Later that night, as they sat by the fire, the silence between them wasn't tense. It was understanding. They had faced the storm together, and in the process, something unspoken had shifted between them. The snowfall had eased, and the clearing around the cabin was bathed in pale sunlight. Grace ventured outside to gather firewood, relishing the rare stillness of the day. The snow crunched under her boots as she reached the stack near the edge of the clearing. She was bending to pick up a log when she heard it was a low, guttural growl. Slowly, she turned her breath, catching in her throat. A wolf stood at the edge of the forest, its eyes locked onto hers. Two more appeared from the shadows, their movements slow and deliberate. Caleb screamed, dropping the firewood. The wolves responded to her cry, their growls growing louder as they inched closer. Grace backed away, her heart pounding. One wolf darted forward, its teeth snapping just inches from her leg. The cabin door flew open and Caleb appeared with a rifle in hand. "Get behind me," he shouted. Grace ran to him, her breath visible in the freezing air. Caleb fired a shot. The crack echoes through the forest. The wolves yelped and retreated, but they didn't go far. Caleb stepped forward, his voice firm. "Go on," he shouted again. And finally the wolves disappeared into the trees. The tension in the clearing eased, but Grace's heart was still racing as Caleb turned to her. "You shouldn't go that far from the cabin," he said, his tone softer now. Grace nodded, her breath shaky. "I didn't realize they'd come so close." Caleb glanced toward the forest, his eyes narrowing. "They're desperate." "It's been a hard winter for them too," he muttered. Together they gathered the scattered firewood and returned to the cabin. The days grew longer and the snow began to melt, revealing patches of earth that had been hidden for months. The cabin no longer felt like a prison to Grace. It had become a home. She planted a small garden by the edge of the clearing, her hands working the soil while Caleb mended the fence nearby. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Caleb handed Grace a small wooden carving. It was rough and uneven, but unmistakably a figure of a man and a woman standing together. "It's us," he said simply, his voice quiet. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she turned the carving over in her hands, her fingers tracing the delicate details. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, the weight of everything, their struggles, their losses, and their shared triumphs, hung between her lips. Then, with a soft smile, she said, "Thank you, Caleb." Caleb reached out his hand, resting lightly over hers as they stood together in the fading light. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Grace felt a warmth rise in her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. She felt seen. As the stars appeared over the cabin, Grace and Caleb knew their lives would never be the same.